Hello everyone, I'm Anna Fisher, and it turns out I'm not yet done talking about Feyntje van Steenkiste. You might remember Feyntje van Steenkiste for her brief mention in my previous video, Colorful Catholics and Plain Protestants. She was the very plainly dressed wife of a Mennonite potash merchant, and her portrait fascinates me. It honestly fascinates me. As far as I can tell, she was not a noteworthy woman. In fact, the most noteworthy thing about her was that she had her portrait painted. But what this portrait says about Feyntje van Steenkiste's world and how she interacted with it and how her clothing choices interacted with it is really, really interesting to me. And when I look at her portrait, I think of two things right away. The first is the fact that the Pilgrim Fathers, the separatist Calvinist Congregationalists who would become the Pilgrim Fathers, made their money, made New England, the New England colonies prosperous by selling salt cod fished in New England waters to Catholic Europe, so that they would have fish to eat on Fridays when they were not allowed to eat meat. And this is something that would have been morally questionable to the Puritans, because they were extremely, or I should say the separatists, because they weren't actually Puritans, because they were extremely and vociferously anti-Catholic. They saw Catholicism as fake Christianity, as secret paganism. They wanted to strip every trace of Catholic popery and paganism out of their religious lives and practice. And many of them would not have been okay with contributing to Catholic ritual practice in this way. But they did. And this is one of the ways that New England became a prosperous colony. The other is slavery. And I say colony, it was actually several colonies. But the other was slavery, because New England merchants were involved heavily in the slave trade. And the other thing that it makes me think of is the Quaker ideas about plain dress. For Quakers, it's not really about plainness of dress. It's about simplicity of dress and simplicity of living. It's about living and dressing and eating and breathing and as I said, living in a way that imposed the least possible amount on other people and their labor as possible. You know, it was very much about simplifying your life so that you didn't actually impinge on anyone else's life. It was about, as the Quakers themselves put it, living simply so that others may simply live. And then I look at Feyntje van Steenkiste and her portrait, and this is not the style of plain dress that she ascribed to. This portrait is designed to show off three attributes: her prosperity, her piety, and her moral purity. And her prosperity is shown very deliberately, both in the fact that she had a portrait at all painted, which took money. That was no accident. And her black dress, which would have been made with expensive color-fast logwood dye, and her ruff, which took a lot of labor and expense. And this dress doesn't fit any kind of plain dress idea that would say, don't be ostentatious with your wealth or your class. She's actually being very ostentatious here in her own way with her wealth and her class. Her very austere black and white and plain against the wall way of portraying herself doesn't change that. The lack of she's idealized, but she's not beautified in this portrait. She's not made to be more beautiful and appealing in a sort of ethereal or sexually alluring way. She's not beautified, but she's definitely idealized in this portrait. The way she is idealized but not beautified in this portrait is very, very much indicative of her way of living within a class society. She is showing off her class very distinctly here. She is not shying away from the fact that she is a wealthy woman when she is portraying herself as very pious and plainly dressed. As for her moral purity, well, one of the ways that's shown is that very, very white ruff she's wearing. Whiteness in linen was seen to be tied both to personal cleanliness, and also to spiritual cleanliness. And you will see this throughout the literature and portraiture of the period. White linen is associated with moral purity, and dirty linen, linen that is no longer pure white, is associated both with bodily uncleanness and also spiritual uncleanness. And to maintain that lovely white ruff, she had to employ servants, because that white ruff was made out of a strip of white linen that had to be pressed and starched and pleated every time it was worn. And it had to be laundered before that. And she probably had many, many ruffs, and often may have changed them more than once a day to maintain that crisp whiteness. And this would have, of course, used a lot of labor, and she would have employed servants for this. And so that is one way in which she was definitely impinging on other people's lives and on their labor. But the ruff and the black dress go beyond that. The blackness of the dress, as I mentioned, would have been from logwood dye, which was acquired from Spain. And this is what actually really interests me about, this is why I bring up the salt cod and the Quake and the Puritans, because the logwood puts her in a sort of reverse position, where she is, instead of providing a ritual good to the Catholics, she is in fact taking a ritual good from the Catholics that she is paying for. The logwood dye was harvested in Portuguese and Spanish colonial possessions, and those colonial possessions funded the crowns, the Spanish and Portuguese crowns, as well as the Catholic Church itself. This would have been used to fund, for example, the Inquisition and the wars of religion on the Catholic side, and also the forced conversions and semi-forced conversions of the indigenous peoples of the Spanish colonial possessions. And this is something that she probably, if she thought about it, would have had moral qualms with, expanding Catholicism, giving Catholicism this money and power that they would have used to hurt Protestants. And so it fascinates me that she is wearing these black clothes, that this is considered to be the appropriate modest dress in her community. But also her ruff and her dress tied her very closely to slavery, because the logwood that would have made the color fast black dye and the rice starch for her ruff would both have been products that were produced by slave labor. The logwood would have been harvested by slaves, and the rice for the rice starch would have been grown and harvested by slaves. In fact, the expansion of slavery in the New World was closely tied to the production of dyestuffs as much as it was to sugar. So her dress ties her very intimately to slavery and the propagation of slaves and forced labor. And I want to say very clearly that I'm wearing a shirt right now that was produced in Cambodia, probably through a very, very exploitive labor system. So I'm not trying to claim that my lifestyle is somehow more pure than Feyntje van Steenkiste's. I'm just, pointing out that her very, very pure, modest dress tied her to some extremely exploitive and cruel systems. And this is not something that she appears to have considered in her choice of what modesty meant, or in her community's choice of what modesty meant. And also, it's interesting to ponder where the money for her particular type of plain, modest, pure, morally pure dress came from. It came from her husband, who was a potash merchant. And potash was a major component in gunpowder. And this would have made him a merchant of death. And in the 17th century, thanks to the wars of religion and the colonial expansion in the New World, business was good. So, since this is actually a channel that is supposed to be about helping writers, fantasy writers, and world builders make more realistic constructed worlds, what does this tell us about how worlds work? Well, one of the things it tells us is that you want to consider where everything in your world comes from. Where do your characters' clothes come from? Where does the dye come from? Where does the fabric come from? Where do the materials to make them come from? What is the labor involved in making them? Well, what are the costs to the world, to other people, of a character's food, clothing, lifestyle in every way? Where does this all come from and what does it all mean? This is something that is pretty granular and pretty deep into a world, but it's very interesting to consider. Anyway, if you liked this video, if you got this far and liked this video, please consider liking and subscribing and hitting that little notification bell, and maybe even leaving me a comment. I hope you had a wonderful day, and if it hasn't been wonderful so far, I hope it gets better. Social media links are in the description below, and bye for now, and I hope to see you in the next one. Thank you.